Hello, beautiful visionaries. This is Lorna Liana, and today I am so excited to bring to you Dr. Joe Tafur, who I had the pleasure of meeting at the Plant Teachers Conference in Los Angeles, the World Ayahuasca Conference in Rio Branco, Brazil, and Psychedelic Science in Oakland, California. So, Joe is a Colombian-American integrative family physician and ceremonial practitioner. He is also the author of The Fellowship of the River, a medical doctor's exploration into the traditional Amazonian plant medicines. After completing postdoctoral research at UCSD over a period of 6 years, he lived and worked in the Peruvian Amazon at the Traditional Healing Center, Niue Rao Centro Espiritual. He will share with us today his research into ayahuasca healing from a medical perspective, as well as his theory relating ayahuasca shamanism to epigenetics. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Lorna. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. So I'd love to have you share with us your journey on how you have been able to reconcile your role as a doctor trained in Western medicine and this bizarre world of Amazonian shamanism.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's it's bizarre. The bizarreness of it is a cultural perspective, right? Like,
it is. You're right.
But the locals, they see a lot of what we do as bizarre, and and that's how culture is across the planet, right? They're so. So in fact, they're just human beings. When you sit down and you live with them and you spend time with them, you realize you have a lot to talk about. The way you would with anybody that you could share with, or maybe if you share language. And so. What connected me to them was healing work, was healing work with people. That's how we got along and we got interested in each other, was watching the kind of healing that they were doing with their tradition, the same way that traditional Chinese medicine has impressed people from kind of Western allopathic backgrounds or Ayurvedic medicine or, other forms of thought and other fields or cultural practices. And so and that's kind of what the book is about, is looking at these cases, cases of people that have medical diagnoses that have been going to the doctor, Western doctor, for years and years and haven't had any success with problems like PTSD, kind of the classic post-traumatic stress disorder, or anxiety or depression, or even some cases that are, they're anecdotes, but they're still cases that I present, migraine headaches or chronic cough that's not responding to any kind of treatment, even some forms of psoriasis, some skin problems, or Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, or anxiety. I don't know if I already mentioned that, addiction. So those are problems that myself as a family medicine doctor, I've seen many of those people just come through the healthcare system and not get help. And then you go down and you see these people practicing what a lot of people would consider to be very bizarre kind of treatment modalities, and yet they're having success with exactly these kind of people. And so the way to bridge the different perspectives is the individual, the person that he gets healed. That's for a real doctor, that's the most interesting thing, is taking care of somebody. More interesting, in fact, than whatever paradigm that they might want to cling to. Because of perhaps their own personal fears or whatever it is, some kind of indoctrination, or, it could be just being skeptical in a wise fashion and wanting to be responsible. And there's definitely that element. We want to be very careful and responsible and in medicine in general. But ultimately, as Ralph Metzner, he repeats this all the time, science is not medicine. Science is not medicine. That's two different fields. And so there's people who are very dedicated medicine people who do what they can to take care of people. And sometimes they have to kind of expand their paradigm or go beyond the paradigm. And most people, in fact, when they're quite ill or someone that they love is quite ill, are quite ready to expand their paradigm. Those are just basic facts. So I think that ultimately it's about healing, and that's what drives the entire interest. And so then in the book, I do try to map a connection between these two worlds around the patient, because a lot of times I get that question, how can you as a doctor make sense of these two worlds, because the Westerner in particular is so threatened by an expanded worldview. It's terrifying. It seems to me like versus indigenous practitioners who might drink ayahuasca, let's say, in a traditional ceremony and be like, wow, that was really something. But I don't hear them responding with the same thing of like, oh my God, it's not how I thought it was, which is quite common for the Westerner to say, because there's really there's something, off about our culture. There's something off that is like, we kind of like, if we kind of see how off it is, it's quite disturbing. I don't know. I find that to be the case. And down there, people don't necessarily have to make that leap, as far as some kind of like overlooked human elements, within their own culture that people would be. And so that's what I kind of talk about, is that what is the big factor that people seem to get? And I'm not, the book is about ayahuasca shamanism largely, but not really. It's more about spiritual healing and the role of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. And what is it that's made possible when we include the emotional and spiritual dimensions of health, when we allow for the subjective experience of human life to enter, medical treatment. And when we start listening to people and start exploring, what role did how they feel in their heart and soul, and perhaps in many cases how emotional trauma, maybe have shaped even their physiology of their own physical being, and to start addressing that in a way and taking the time to address that and help people work through that kind of stuff, and then seeing how that kind of spiritual and even energetic approach to the emotional body, so to speak, leads to these improvements in the mind body, in the physical health and the mental health that are more kind of the focus of Western practice. So it's all about including the emotional and spiritual dimensions of health. That's what really is where the breakthrough happened for the cases that I present in the book. And it's why they needed to leave their culture to find healing, because within their culture and the kind of healthcare system that they had access to, there wasn't really that possibility to really go, let's say, through their insurance-based system or whatever healthcare system that they are paying into, for somebody to really explore, like, wow, how is it that perhaps the course of their lives and the emotional traumas of their lives may be contributing to their current physical state of health? And then how might you heal those emotional wounds? Do you need, or is it in fact the case that with some kind of expanded spiritual, expanded mystical approach, that once again, according to, like everyone repeats, according to all the quantum physicists and everything else, like if the most honest, rational, logical Western scientist, keeps pointing to the fact that we're made out of this material world, that the materialists cling to so deeply is made out of this extremely mysterious, material, whatever you want to call it, immaterial. And so there it is. The mystery remains, whether we like to talk about it or admit it, there it is, every single time. And so if we engage and embrace the mystery and we don't exclude the mystery from the discussion, then that allows for a context in which people can do a lot of emotional healing, in which forgiveness becomes a possibility, in which compassion is something you have access to, in which gratitude is something that people can really, sense and feel, and then self-love, and the role of that in normalizing people's physiology. So that's some of the discussion of the book and what I talk about, and the direction of that kind of thinking. And that's how I, do it, is it's the patient, how do I make sense of what happened to this person? Because, I'm a doctor, but, the shamanism, how do I make sense? It's like, well, it's a real person, and they had Crohn's disease, and now they don't have Crohn's disease. And what happened to them was a very spiritual, mystical experience in their healing process that has correlates in the physical anatomy and physiology.
So I'd love to dive into some of the more specifics of the case studies that you bring up in your book. But before I do that, I'm curious to know, you had said earlier in this conversation that there's something off with our culture. I'm curious to know what you think is off in our culture. I mean,
Right.
I have, my own ideas about that, and I'm always interested to hear what other people say.
Yeah, I think, like traveling the world and there you are in Spain and, just different perspectives and, let's say in the Amazon and, the African shaman Malidoma Somé, he's a very interesting guy and a very bright, brilliant person and an author and a multiple PhD and a traditional healer. He comments that, what's missing in his opinion, like observing Western culture, he's like, well, what's missing are three basic human elements. Number one, nature, a connection to nature. So it's the disconnect, is really the nature of the problem. So a disconnection from nature is the first issue, where you have business, whatever corporate entities that, we wouldn't even think twice about polluting the water where we live. That's just a natural consequence of making money or of providing services, or even the goal of what would it be like if in a major U.S. city, if the water was clean in the river that flowed through it, what a breakthrough that would be. And yet that's such a struggle, to try to promote that consciousness, because on top of the difficulties of, whatever technological processes that are polluting that we do depend on, and that whole battle, you're going to interfere with people making money also. So the nature, the human being who's evolved, in a natural setting, in a natural world, and the disconnect from nature and natural cycles and natural environments is hard on the system. And there's new research like forest bathing research out of Japan. I don't know if you've run across that.
Yeah.
But, that's real interesting how healing it can be. Then he talks about community, the disconnect from a community, that the human being is kind of evolved and to exist within a community. And so when we don't have community, and in this case, I would say in North American life, or at least in the United States, where people are at work most of the time, where work is the culture. And so they don't really have time to form a community the way you would if you weren't at work. Basically, I think that the work hours is the major cultural problem, and the time that gets kind of like given over to that, and the simulated culture of like work parties and work happiness and work this and work that, versus kind of like the organic type of culture that would be formed when people have free time outside of work that you see all over the world. Exactly. For example, here where I live in Phoenix, as opposed to, let's say, Ibiza, Spain, where you are, in parts of Spain where they have kind of a long history of cultural existence beyond the corporate, culture, that they would have the time to develop local cuisine and local fashion and local music tradition. There's not a whole lot of that where I live, because people are a little too busy to be doing things like that, to have festivals that are just purely for the social and communal, benefit of the society. There's tons of that in Latin America, right? There's so many holidays and people are just getting together to get together. And so the lack of community is very rough on the human being. And we see that manifest in many ways. And then in the same fashion, the kind of overriding corporate culture in which child rearing is kind of disregarded. In other words, that you'd want to spend the time with your children, and that would solve so many like cultural issues and ultimately health issues. Healthcare costs would probably be reduced, if people had the time to be with their families and raise their kids, and how much that childhood trauma of all that kind of, and then on top of it, of course, as you see the difficulty, and I know these are big problems, and I'm not trying to say, but it's worth commenting the difficulty how difficult it is for people to raise children in isolation. When you're just in a single family home and you're just getting back from your work and you're there with your little children, and how stressed out people are trying to deal with that, versus in an Amazonian village where raising children is like nothing. I've never heard anyone complain about it. It's like the most normal.
It's a communal thing.
It's a communal thing. And so in other words, in the communal setting, it's quite easy. And when you don't have a communal setting, it becomes very difficult for a lot of people. So that's one example where with the lack of community. And then when you're talking about your personal goals and helping people find their purpose, where, you know, within a community is one of the ways that people would come to that, to recognize their unique gifts, their independent gifts, would be through the consensus of the community. You know, rather than comparing themselves to online celebrities, you know, you actually compare yourselves to the people that you live around and you interact with, and you realize, wow, I'm good at this. This is a way I can contribute. Here's how I can help, you know, instead of comparing yourself to this virtual, you know, population that doesn't care about you at all, or love you, or even talk to you, or touch you, or is meaningless, in fact, to you. You know, you are meaningless to them. You know, they are not part of your personal world. And yet that becomes so much a part of like social life in the States right now, I think is about what's going on in the media and the media personalities versus, and that's like, well, because you're at work and then you come home and you have TV and, you know, but versus like, you know, let's say, I don't know what it's like in Ibiza, but where you can just go into a public square or public setting and be around people, you know, and that consensus of the community helps you to kind of understand maybe who you are and who you want to be in the world. So that also becomes difficult, I think, alone, or in the loneliness of the modern society. Then the last piece that Malidoma Somé talks about, so he talks about disconnect from nature, which is in fact part of our living community, disconnect from human community, and then a disconnection from spirit. You know, that there's direct mystical access through, not necessarily through psychedelics, although that's one option that people are exploring. You know, we just discussed that a little before the show. But just direct mystical access through ritual and ceremony, or through meditation, or the encouragement of that, or the allowance for people to talk about that, you know, that something strange happened to them, something supernatural happened to them, and they want to be able to talk about that mystery component of their life in which they know they're born, they know they live, and they know they're going to die. And so through this lifespan that they have, you know, there's a lot of mysterious things, at the very least at the bookends, and then throughout it. And so having a place to talk about that and to reach into, people would say, higher dimensional planes of consciousness or thought, where a lot of people find a lot of nourishment from that kind of connection and that kind of faith. And so, you know, I think those are three elements that Malidoma Somé has pointed out that I bring up a lot. I think it's very concisely put. And that if we were to focus on encouraging those three connections in people, and so that's what we see when we take people down to the Amazon and you put them into a natural setting, you know, in the forest, and there they are living in nature, and they're in a community immediately of people that are all interested in their healing, and they get to socialize and live in that community, you know, every day while they're there in the process. And then through the ceremony, and just through their experience, they end up, you know, having access into very mystical states. And then when they're given those three things together like that in a retreat center, you see this immense potential for shift, because all those things together kind of makes up for all this disconnect that they've been experiencing through their culture and their society.
So you've witnessed people that have had chronic health issues that they haven't been able to resolve through the Western allopathic system, that they were able to resolve after spending, let's say, a week in ayahuasca ceremony?
I mean, so there's different degrees of it. So we've definitely seen some people in 10 days make amazing shifts. Some of them have made incredible shifts. Other people in 3 weeks, other people in 1 month. And other people with prolonged treatments, you know, lasting several months, or recurrent treatment, you know, making a gain and then coming back and making another gain, coming back and making another gain. But those gains leading to what, you know, very significant clinical, you know, endpoints, as you would say, like as a doctor. In other words, they don't need medication anymore. They don't have physical symptoms anymore. Those kind of clinical endpoints.
Got it. So I'm curious to know about Crohn's disease, because I've seen, you know, mentions to ayahuasca being able to help people who have it and even cure people of it. Can you tell me, you know, more about what Crohn's disease actually is? What are the causes
Sure,
of it, and how
sure.
ayahuasca helps resolve that?
So Crohn's disease is a form of, so I'm not, there's no big studies on ayahuasca, as a doctor, like just to be responsible, there's no big studies on Crohn's disease and ayahuasca. So we just have these anecdotes, we have people reporting back to us that they're seeing some shifts. And then I discuss a case kind of in depth in the book of a Crohn's disease person. And Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disease, which means there's some kind of autoimmune inflammation. Your own body starts generating inflammation, a lot of times in the large colon or, in the intestines. And so you start having a lot of pain. Sometimes they have like recurrent diarrhea. Sometimes they're having bloody, bowel movements. Sometimes they're having a lot of weakness and fatigue and malnutrition associated with that. So it can be very crippling. In the case presented in the book, the inflammation can be so bad that it can actually kind of burn a hole through the intestine, so you have these perforations and these leaks. And so then people need surgery, once they start leaking stool into their abdomen because it's just so frail. Just imagine just like super inflamed, if your cheek was so inflamed with some bad sore that just got worse and worse and worse. And eventually, holes start forming through the cheek. It's something like that is going on in there. And that is, this guy had multiple surgeries. He had 3 different surgeries. And in one case, he had like a ostomy, where he has to actually, when they cut a section out and then they have to put it back together, like sometimes when it's too inflamed, you can't put it back together right away. So you have an ostomy bag while things calm down in there. So he has 3 months. He's sitting there with a bag, that he uses instead of going to the bathroom. So pretty intense disease. What is the cause of Crohn's disease? Well, so it's believed that there's some kind of genetic component. There's some kind of tendency towards it. There's obviously, dietary factors, people, what you eat and stuff can probably make it worse. There's ways to like kind of more anti-inflammatory diet to help. And then there's, then there's the mystery of it. And we know that people a lot of times have exacerbations and flares associated with psychological stress. When people are very stressed out and they have a history of Crohn's disease, it's not uncommon for that to flare up and get worse. So it's known that there's some kind of stress component to it. That being said, something that I hadn't thought about much as a doctor until I read about it doing research on the case was that it's kind of a known established fact in the scientific literature that Crohn's is there's a lot of comorbidity, like we say, in other words, it's associated quite commonly with anxiety and depression. So that there is some known correlated, maybe not in every case, but common enough to make the data, statistically significant connection between anxiety, depression, and Crohn's disease. So that there would be some psychological stress, whatever stress that kind of fed into the anxiety and depression would also be related to these symptoms that they're having. And so on the biological level, they're talking about this neurogenic inflammation. So those nerves down there in your intestines are just generating this inflammation, not because there's an insult or injury, not because there's an infection. It's just coming from somewhere. So then one of the theories that I propose is that it seems like it's some kind of smoldering emotional disturbance, and you can map it out to this emotional body the way the autonomic nerves that are feeding into the intestines are connected directly to the limbic system of the brain, the emotional processing system of the brain. And they're related to this network, the psychoneuroendocrine immunologic network, which is this well-studied network that's being described by mind-body research. And so that network is what I'm calling the emotional body. So then we're seeing this emotional body crying out. We're seeing this person who has, in fact, this guy was depressed and he was suicidal and he had bad Crohn's disease. And so you see, like I say, disturbances in multiple elements of the emotional body. He's got psychological problems that are clear. He's suicidally depressed. He's got this intestinal inflammation that's going on at the same time. And no one's really connecting those two things.
So he was depressed before he had the Crohn's disease?
Ongoing, simultaneously, he had different degrees of depression And so that's the whole thing. So he being depressed and being a difficult patient, and when he was younger, he didn't really follow up that well with his doctors. He would get sick, go to the hospital, have surgery, come out of it, maybe take the pills, maybe not. He didn't like the whole system. So as far as people addressing his mental health needs and saying, hey, wow, maybe this is because you're so, suffering mentally so much. Maybe if we got that better, your Crohn's disease would get better. But that kind of thinking for me as a doctor, having been through medical training, at least in the era that I went through, was not necessarily like the direction you go, family practice. If I have Crohn's disease, the way I was trained, or, and maybe I'm an ignorant physician, but we would just, eventually you send them to the gastroenterologist. The gastroenterologist is going to examine them and, put them on immunosuppressive medication like steroids, prednisone, to calm down that inflammation, or some other pharmaceutical that's going to calm down inflammation. But as far as the source of that inflammation, it remains a mystery, right? It's autoimmune. It's just coming out of nowhere. And so then the question is, well, what is the disturbance in the system that's leading to that? Is that something that can be healed? So in his case, when you go down to a place like where we were running at Niue Rao, and you can spend the time with the person, and immediately, because we're in a shamanic context, so the spiritual and emotional dimensions of his illness are going to be addressed immediately upon arrival. Like, we want to hear about your emotional history. We need to know about the traumas of your life. We need to understand about that. Turns out this guy had a very traumatic, background. Grew up, didn't know his biological father. His mother ended up being with multiple guys that, were very physically abusive with him. And then ultimately, he had a more consistent stepfather who was very violent with him. And he eventually ran away because of this violence, like in his early teens, and with the help of an uncle kind of became independent and just entered the workforce quietly, and ended up being an engineer for trains in Canada, and worked like that, and had a lot of, problems from that time. And when he was a lot of anger issues in his early 20s, and was he depressed or not, he wasn't really addressing that. He had his Crohn's disease started developing in his early 20s, had some surgeries, had some really bad bouts. There were times that got better, had a girlfriend that sent him to anger management that helped a little bit. He tried some doctor recommended antidepressants. He tried it a little bit. He didn't like it. And so he just kind of floated around, with his problem just getting worse and worse, till he got to this point where, like, I think I'm going to kill myself, and I don't like any of the treatment options available to me. And he heard on a podcast about ayahuasca and decided to try it. So then when he goes down there and he tells us, then the focus is going to be healing those kind of traumas, and inviting spiritual energy, and in this case from the plant medicine traditions, to help him to heal. And he's obviously going to be on this very strict diet, which just being on that alone versus his bacon-filled breakfast sandwiches every day, things started to get better. And then just the mystical experiences that he had, as far as feeling like his brain was getting reprogrammed, and learning how to forgive his stepfather. And then also the revelation of repressed memories of sexual abuse that had to be verified. A lot of people imagine these things, or we don't always know if it's true. He had an experience that he was informed through his ayahuasca ceremonies that his aunt had sexually abused him. And it resonated with him, so he went and followed up and found out, yes, it's true, and his cousins and he had all been sexually abused for a period of time. And so working through that trauma and through all the healing and forgiveness around that, in other words, that's where the spiritual component comes in, is how do you clear that out? So there's some kind of like cleansing, there's a purging, to release that kind of energy that happens. That's kind of also been described in feels like somatic experience therapy, that you need to release, a grieving process, let's say. Something has to come out and then the transformation and the healing that is going to happen through spiritual means. That is to say, through forgiveness, through compassion with the stepfather, through compassion with the aunt even, and the larger, lessons of life. And then ultimately learning how to love himself, when there was so much confusion and hate and shame in his internal world. And when he goes through that process, within weeks, he has a complete resolution of his gastrointestinal symptoms.
Just gone.
Gone. Like he had a flare a year later. He had a flare when he was going through a divorce court, dealing with the child custody problems. And so then he started. So when he has little spasms, he takes medicinal marijuana to that helps him with the spasms, but it doesn't turn into full blown, disease the way he had, and then simultaneously his depression resolves. So that's where we start getting into this idea of like what I propose, the epigenetics. So just the epigenetics, just to touch on the topic, is
and before you do that, so I want to ask you to define epigenetics for those of you who don't know, including myself.
Exactly. So epigenetics. So this whole idea of epigenetics being a factor in this kind of healing is a theory. Okay, it's not substantiated, but there's a lot of reason to propose this theory. And epigenetics is basically the way that genes are expressed can be changed within the lifespan to make it look like it's a genetic problem, In other words, like it's the way that genes, the alteration of the expression of genes. Okay, and I should have a better way of describing this. The way that Biology of Belief is a book
by Bruce Lipton
about epigenetics, and Bruce Lipton. So Bruce Lipton, the way he explains it to people, he's like, it's like there's the DNA blueprint. This blueprint, the hardwire, like your destiny, your genes or your destiny kind of thinking that people have. And then there's the epigenetics, meaning that which lies on top of the genes. Epi means on top, like epidermis. So the epigenetics is that which sits on top of the genes, that he describes it as the contractor. So that's the contractor that reads the blueprint and decides how are we going to express the blueprint. And that is in response to the environment. So there's a constant communication from the outside world to the epigenetics, which is this biochemical machinery that's sitting on top of the genes, that's going to decide how this, hard-coded, destiny genes are actually going to be expressed. So there's a whole other level of versatility of the genetic system. So examples of that are like, the simplest example is that every single cell that you have in your body has the same DNA, right? Like we understand that. And yet you have a skin cell, you have a blood cell, and you have a nerve cell made out of the same exact DNA. So what's different about each one is the software. Okay, that's how I talk about it. Versus the hardware of the genetic code. You have the software, the programming that is imprinted in each cell. So you're going to be a blood cell. Now the genes are directed to express themselves in that way. And that imprinting can get locked in. So that's always going to be a blood cell, But then you can actually deprogram it and go backwards, and they create these stem cells again, or they find ways to deprogram a cell, turn it into a pluripotent cell, a cell that can now be everything again. And they can make Dolly the sheep out of a mammary gland cell that they pulled out of a sheep. They deprogram it and then reprogram it and start the whole thing again. That's all epigenetics. Okay. It's the software around the genes. And so then we hadn't been really thinking about this in Western medicine so much. You see these problems like addiction, and people are saying, oh, addiction, it's a biological thing, because they're born that way. Their families like that. They're all alcoholics. And it's just like, but if you're thinking as a biologist, why would you ever evolve a gene to make somebody addicted to alcohol? Like in a biological setting, like that doesn't make any sense. And so what is it that leads to, and so there's a lot of diseases that are looking very epigenetic. Cancer is one of them. So where you could have some genes that might be like prone to cancer, you had the risky gene, you've got it, but it has to get turned on. It has to get turned on. And so there's a lot of environmental factors that promote that cancer. And so it's like I said, like I tell people, everyone's like, oh, where's cancer coming from? Where's cancer? Oh, the mystery of cancer. And yet Fukushima happens, and everyone's like, we better get the hell out of Fukushima because we're all going to get cancer. In other words, we know that there's a huge environmental component to cancer. Mm-hmm. And we know that carcinogens that are constantly being played down by modern industry is a huge factor in cancer, lung cancer and smoking. You know, it's just like how long there's other things, of course, that contribute to cancer, but environmental and its a role in altering epigenetics and leading to the expression of cancer genes is a very real issue. So other things that are looking like very epigenetic, you know, diabetes type 2, where people are developing diabetes because of their lifestyle and their nutrition, and that's compiling, and it's getting stronger and stronger as the generations go. Oh, it's genetic. But then no one had it like 4 generations back. But it's piling up because of the lifestyle and all this sugar and all the other stuff and all these other things that people are eating. And then it looks like a genetic problem. Another thing is like that's being explored, these neurodegenerative diseases that are popping up more and more. And, you know, in the industrial societies, or maybe just because people are living longer, but Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, you know, then you've got autism that people are trying to sort that out, what's going on there. And then you've got mental health problems that are looking like, wow, there's a lot of epigenetics involved in anxiety, in depression, and all the basic, you know, those particular mental health problems and their relationship to PTSD, which is a form of anxiety, and then addiction, which ultimately is some kind of emotional problem. You know, the way Gabor Mate and all these other people are saying, it's like you've got some people who are very uncomfortable with the way they feel, and they seek mood-altering substances to modulate their emotional experience. And that's really the nature of addiction. And so they're showing how epigenetics, for example, in depression is like, wow, there's a lot of epigenetics here. In other words, people are being told, oh, you're depressed, like forever. You have chronic depression. You're born that way. You have a chemical imbalance. Like you should be on pills for the rest of your life. That's a pretty new idea, you know, on this planet. Like, although I'm sure there's that to that point of articulation that you be condemned, you know, versus exploring the kind of trauma the person has been through, in particular during their emotional development, like this biological window of a known fact that the emotional system, although it is altered, of course, later in life, but has a huge, like a period of time in childhood where people are learning how to relate to others, how to relate to themselves, and how imprinted they become by those early experiences, and how those experiences, in fact, imprint their biology. And epigenetics is one place where we can observe this and prove this, that if in primate studies, for example, if you have the monkeys and you take them away from their mom, and you see that they end up having these, what I would call like, you know, disturbances in their emotional development, and that stay with them in a lifelong fashion. So for the rest of their lives, they have difficulty socializing with the other monkeys. They have difficulty coping with stress, and they have difficulty coping with their own emotional state. You know, this is like the neurolimbic dysfunction. This is emotional trauma. This is what it looks like. And so then the idea that is not a hardware problem, that is a software problem. And that just as software screwed it up, maybe you could reprogram it. Maybe there's a window there to fix that previously was seen, oh, that's genetic. They're going to be like that. Or even if it's not genetic, whatever, they just throw them away. There's no way to fix that. You know, there's no way to fix this kind of PTSD from sexual abuse. There's no way to fix this kind of PTSD from Vietnam vets. Like they're still, it's 40 years, it's 50 years. Well, they can't get better. There's no way to fix this person who has this chronic depression. That's them. They're going to be like that till they die. And so that's where we have to expand the paradigm, you know, because if there is a way, people they want to know about it. So then we see this MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial, which is not just about MDMA, it's about the context, the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial, where this psychotherapeutic modality that they've developed with MDMA is the one that's making the big impact. And they're treating people who are only treatment non-responders. Mm-hmm. The only way to get into that study is because nothing has worked. Mm-hmm. In other words, these are the hopeless cases that the Western system has said, The responsible Western practitioner would say, we don't know how to help you. The irresponsible, arrogant Western practitioner would say, there is no help for you. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, some of these people are finding this treatment and they're finding out, like, wow, this is a complete shift. And they're seeing these people shift after this 12-week intervention, and their symptoms are going away. Symptoms that in PTSD, they do have a physiologic basis. They have studied the way people's brains, their limbic emotional brain, are disturbed in PTSD. You can demonstrate how a lot of these people have autonomic disturbances with their heart rate and their blood pressure and all kinds of things, and their digestion, just constant anxiety. The way it expresses itself physically is a very real thing. And then they're psychological with nightmares and all that kind of stuff. And then you see a complete resolution of that. And then they have 83% of people who are non-responders are now responding to treatment. And in the follow-up, 1 year, 2 years later, like over 60% are still showing improvement. So in other words, something changed, something shifted. And that shift, there's reason to believe there's a biological shift that would also have to happen. For example, when somebody quits smoking, tobacco cessation with the psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, there was a thing I think at Johns Hopkins, they did a tobacco cessation trial. That, everyone thinks nicotine addiction is so physical. It's so physical. And then they find out that it was because the people had a very mystical experience is how they were able to quit smoking, consistently. And so it's this idea of where does this mystical experience touch base with the biochemistry? And so I make the argument in the book that the epigenetics appears to be a part of the biochemistry that's sensitive to what appears to be very subtle energies, at the very least, to the presence of love or the lack of love. In the example of the childhood, the monkey stuff, and they've also done related stuff looking at stress response, what they call maladaptive stress response in human children, that you would start to develop these maladaptive stress responses to so much trauma that you're just trying to protect yourself. You're just trying to defend yourself. Your system, your biology is trying to do that. And there's a lot of, so just to add another version of epigenetics, there's these mice, the mouse studies where they show that if you shock them with a certain smell and you condition them to be traumatized by that smell, so now when they smell the smell with no shock, they start physiologically responding, right? They go into a whole stress response physically, like their hormone levels and their heart rate, everything is going to, because they've been conditioned to watch out. That's danger. That's bad. That smell. So that actually stays in the mouse population for several generations. You can now introduce that smell to their kids and to their grandkids and a multiple number of generations, where just when they get exposed to the smell, they're going to freak out. To a smell they've never smelled before in their life. They were just born. And so this is part of the versatility of the epigenetic biology that you'd want. Because similarly, if there was something gratifying, if there was a smell of, so if they move into a new ecosystem and there's some fruit that is very nutritious for them, and that smell, they automatically, so the instinct is partially epigenetic, that there would be some instincts that would be passed on through multiple generations. And this is one of the reasons that we have that kind of software technology in our system, is to be able to adapt, and for our future generations to adapt readily to new ecosystems. The problem is you can have maladaptive programming in there that can pile up. And if it doesn't get diffused, it'll stay with you in the lifespan, and it can even be passed on to future generations. This is what is called ancestral trauma. And now there's evidence that Holocaust survivors, for example, from World War II, that their kids who are showing high levels of anxiety and depression that was previously thought to be due to bad parenting, because, they're so traumatized. And then they show they have the same epigenetic imprints as their parents from the wartime. So that's ancestral trauma. So these are the kind of things that epigenetics are starting to explore. And what's interesting to me is that they're completely related to the kind of energies that, the shaman Ricardo Maringo that I work with and that I train with, they said that's what we need to clean. This is what the person needs cleaning. The energies related to this trauma, the energies related to this war, The energy is related to their, the sexual abuse. The energy is related to the abandonment. Once you address those things, or try to address those things, in this case from a mystical perspective, but ultimately in a way that's going to promote an emotional healing and a purging of that energy, then you're going to allow the emotional system to start working again in a more natural homeostatic way, and the symptoms start going away.
Fascinating. So we're about at the end of our session. I would like for you to, if you can, if there's any way for you to summarize your theory about ayahuasca, healing, and epigenetics, because you've given so many different examples. So just to kind of condense that
kind
thought.
of a lot. Yeah, sorry I could cover all that. Maybe it's too much.
Well, it's fascinating.
Bottom line is shamanic approaches, use spiritual healing techniques that can promote emotional healing. That emotional healing is associated with an emotional biology. That's a real studied materialistic thing. Your hormone levels and all this stuff that people are talking about with their emotional body, and that we do accept, whether it's oxytocin, that kind of stuff people want to talk about, or serotonin in their moods, or cortisol levels, and their fear and their stress, and the way that affects the inflammation in the body. That's emotional biology. You can use spiritual healing techniques to approach the emotional, and then that can lead to that emotional biological shift, then can manifest and demonstrate itself in shifts in the mental health and in the physical health, in the mind body. So just as mind body is paired, then emotion is the bridge between the mind and body, and emotion is also the pair to the energy, okay, to the spiritual, to the mystical, to the subjective experience of life that can't completely be measured and monetized.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that was beautifully expressed. Thank you so much for sharing with us your knowledge as well as your stories and experience. And I really just love the very specific examples you gave. It really helps, it helps really shine a light on all the different, complex mechanisms between physical health, emotional health, spiritual health, and understanding the relationships between all these areas of well-being. So I would love to ask you, how can the audience best stay in touch with you if they wanted to know more about your work?
Yeah, there's two things. There's drjoetafur.com is the website, drjoetafur.com, and then also we have a nonprofit that's just getting going called Modern Spirit, and it's on modernspirit.org, which is demonstrating the value of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. It's trying to explore these topics and promote research and education in these areas. So those are the two ways. And I'm on Facebook and all that kind of stuff.
Great. Well, we'll put the links to those websites down below this video.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the book is also linked on the website.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for your time, and I want to wish you a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. You too. Have a great day, Lorna.